Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm Judy Greenspan, the Director of Public Programs here at the Center for Jewish History. And on behalf of the Center and our partner organizations, the American Jewish Historical Society and the Leo Baeck Institute, I'd like to welcome you to our program this evening. Tonight's conversation with Professor Jason Stanley and journalist and author and Professor Peter Beinart is about fascism, the topic of Jason's most recent book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. By the way, has anybody here read it already? Okay. Jason and Peter both bring a great deal of knowledge to this conversation, and I'd like to share a few highlights from their copious credentials, which are more completely, though not entirely, listed in your programs. Jason Stanley is the Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy at Yale University and the author of 5 books, including the prize-winning How Propaganda Works, which was published in 2015. He's on the board of the Prison Policy Initiative and writes frequently about propaganda, free speech, mass incarceration, democracy, and authoritarianism for numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Peter Beinart is Professor of Journalism and Political Science at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. He's currently a contributor to The Atlantic, a senior columnist at The Forward, a CNN political commentator, and a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. He's the author of 3 books, was the editor of The New Republic from 1999 to 2006. He graduated from Yale University, and he was a Rhodes Scholar. So that's just a snippet. You can read more about them. But when How Fascism Works was released last fall, historian Jan Gross called it a, quote, must-read for all of us who take seriously our responsibility as citizens. To say the book hit a nerve is an understatement. Around 3.5 million people watched the accompanying video Jason made with the New York Times, entitled, If You're Not Scared About Fascism in the US, You Should Be. The book is being translated into 11 languages. It's currently available in Spain, Brazil, Italy, Greece, and Croatia, and soon to be released in Sweden, Poland, Japan, Portugal, and Serbia. Writing the book, Jason drew from 2 deep wells: his scholarship and expertise, and his personal experience as the child of German Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany. My family background, he writes, has saddled me with difficult emotional baggage, but it also, critically, prepared me to write this book. Jason's conversation with Peter tonight is part of our series, First Person. The idea behind this series is to bring personal stories to our stage that, like Jason's, help illustrate and provide insight into larger themes in Jewish history, current events, and culture. Here at the Center for Jewish History, telling our stories, preserving our memories, and using our history to better understand the present are integral to our mission. So before we begin, I'd like to share just a few words about where we are tonight. And I always ask at this point if there's anyone who's never been here before. Always good, great, nice to welcome. So the rest of you might get a little bored, but for those of you who haven't been here. So the Center for Jewish History, to me, is a rare gem in this city. It is a world-renowned research institute for scholars of Jewish history, a destination for public programs, concerts, exhibitions, a place to explore your genealogy, and the center is home to our 5 partner organizations and their extraordinary archival collections. Our partners are the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Sephardi Federation, the Leo Baeck Institute, Yeshiva University Museum, and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. And together they possess the largest repository of Jewish archival material outside of Israel. I think it is quite safe to say that many people walking by this unassuming building on West 16th Street have no idea that tucked away inside is an astonishing treasure trove of materials that spans 1,000 years of history and includes millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of books, thousands of artworks, ritual objects, recordings, and film. So in other words, this building is quite literally filled to the brim with stories. So here's a glimpse of what that looks like. This is in the 12-story building behind us. This is just part of one floor of one partner's archives, this one belonging to the American Jewish Historical Society, so you can imagine walking through 12 stories like that. And not surprisingly, there's a great deal of information in the archives relevant to tonight's program. So a quick search of our digital archives using the word fascism reveals books, pamphlets like this one, and posters of movements and counter-movements here and in Europe. But we have something even more special and personal to show you tonight from the Leo Baeck archives. Jason Stanley's great-grandfather, Magnus Davidson, was the cantor with Rabbi Leo Baeck at the Fascism synagogue in Berlin. I hope I said that right. His grandmother, Ilse Stanley, was instrumental in saving hundreds of Jews from concentration camps prior to her departure from Germany. And to share more of this story, LBI's Director of Public Outreach and archivist, Michael Simonson, prepared a small exhibit case with artifacts from the LBI archives, which is in the Great Hall. So please do take a look right after this program. I'd also add that Jason Stanley's grandmother, Ilse Stanley, was the subject of the 1950s television show This Is Your Life. Are there people here who used to watch that? And it's actually on YouTube right now. It's quite interesting. So finally, I'd like all of you to know that the history in this building is not meant to be hidden away. Our online collections are accessible to the public, as are our reading room, library, and genealogy institute. Exhibitions, public programs, and conferences draw from and showcase the stories and treasures in this building. So on your way out today, please sign up for our mailing list, pick up flyers of our upcoming programs, and we hope you'll come back again and often. So you all were given note cards and pencils when you came in. Those are obviously to jot down questions for the Q&A portion of the program. I will collect those towards the end of Jason and Peter's conversation. And after the program, I hope you'll join us for a book signing and reception in the Great Hall. So thank you, and please join me in welcoming Jason Stanley and Peter Beinart.
Thank you so much. It's really it's a privilege to be here with Jason, and I wanted to start on a personal note. By your family's history is intertwined with your subject material and also with some of the archival material here at the museum. And you said, and I think Judy quoted it, that you felt like your family experience prepared you to write this book. So talk a little bit about that family experience and the lessons that you drew from it.
So my grandmother, I mean, it's incredible for me being at the Leo Baeck Institute because Leo Baeck feels like a family member. My great-grandfather was the Oberkantor at the Fascism synagogue from 1912 until Kristallnacht, and Leo Baeck was a rabbi for many of those years. So my grandmother had this heroic history in Germany, and the German Jewish side is sort of very heavy. So the idea that you're, cosmopolitan values and you maintain your Jewish identity. And my mother is from Poland, Eastern Europe. So I grew up with both my parents having survived the initial parts of my father left at the age of 6 in late July 1939. And my mother came here in 1948 after 8 years in Siberia and Warsaw. And so there were things like that I grew up with that I recognized in my parents remember being called very harsh things when they were young, and that's something that they've passed down to me. That sense of, growing up being in Warsaw in 1947 and being called what they called Jewish people, or when my father started to learn to read and recognizing in the streets of Berlin what they were calling Jewish people. So when I started to think of what young Muslim children in the United States were experiencing, it just, reminded me of things I grew up with.
You wrote a New York Times story about your family experience, and it included a quote from your father that I found very powerful. You said, "Most frequently and passionately, he would reprimand me for taking the Holocaust to be about me or about my family. The Holocaust was about humanity." And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, for you, how you think about the the universalistic lessons of the Holocaust, and how Jews in particular should think about it as a particular legacy, but also as a universal legacy of all humankind.
Fantastic question. Which I struggle with. Being from a German Jewish family is a very particular thing. And being from my German Jewish family, my great uncle was the only Jew in the Wagner ensemble, Max Dawson. He was Siegfried in The Ring in 1901. I come from a German Jewish family that's proud of their Germanness. And so the idea, the commitment of German Jews to universal values and liberalism, and there's a certain structure that, the Holocaust reflected a targeting of people who played a certain role in society. And other people can play that role in society. And then, of course, we have things like the Rwandan genocide and to think about. So there's a phenomenon that is generalizable. How we start to think of humans as prepare them for that kind of violence, and those are the generalizations that. I mean, my father, when I talked about, I used to be like, "Oh, my parents are Holocaust refugees," and he would call me on that, as I noted in that article. And he read me James Baldwin's 1967 piece, "Negroes are anti-Semitic because they're anti-white," and he said, and in it, Baldwin talks about how, you feel lucky not to be us. Your background makes you understand us, and so that made me, and I grew up with that. My mother worked in Manhattan criminal court and saw the parallels. So for me, our duty is to reflect that background, use our personal experience to talk about what could face people, and that's the moral for us.
And yet it often seems that there's a tendency among Jews to draw a different lesson from the Holocaust. I mean, I remember you also quote your mother in that New York Times piece saying, "My mother's most frequent advice was about knowing when to get out of a dangerous situation. She was afraid I would develop an attachment to a country and would not flee early enough." And I have to say, that was very evocative for me. My grandmother, who was born in Alexandria, Egypt, and then grew up in the Belgian Congo, would respond very, very negatively to any expressions of American patriotism she saw me expressing, because she thought it was naive and dangerous. I thought she was archaic and outmoded and from a different world. Maybe she wasn't quite as outmoded as I had thought. But there was also, for her, which you see, I've experienced my entire life, and you probably have as well, an alternative interpretation of that history, which is to say, we don't have the luxury to care about other people, right? We have to look out for ourselves. It's a world where every group looks out for itself, kill or be killed, and we can't afford the benevolence of universalism and liberalism. So how do you respond to that?
So absolutely. My mother worked in Manhattan criminal court for 33 years. She was in Center Street during the Central Park 5 case. So she, with her background, putting together her life, she channeled to me what was happening with our prison system, what was happening. And as I say in that piece that you cite, she wasn't going to march out on the street, but it revealed to her a side of America. But it wasn't like she was just like, she always alerted me to that reality. I mean, she knew the Central Park 5 were innocent at the time, which, and she's no. But so there was that complexity there. I don't think even in the she saw maybe some identification between the situations. But yeah, it confirmed, and definitely she said, don't write a book on fascism.
Because she was afraid of the consequences for...
Don't be out in the sun. She always is like, but don't get in trouble.
Right. Yes, it's so talk about your decision to kind of claim the word fascism, and argue that it's important for us to use it to describe what's happening in Donald Trump's America.
So I think, you get a lot of blowback for historians who say we should just use the term fascism for like movements in the middle 20th century, historically rooted European movements in the middle 20th century. And I think fascism is I'm a philosopher, and some of the great theorists of fascism have been philosophers, Hannah Arendt, Theodor Adorno. And we have thought that there's a structure that fascism represents that can reoccur in different situations, just like you can have democracy reoccur in very different situations, or liberalism, or socialism. There's a literature, Leopold Senghor, in the definition of African socialism says, well, you can't just take the European concepts and put them here, but there's a slight variation of socialism that will work for Africa. And similarly, I think fascism American fascists wouldn't call themselves fascists because it's a Euro-trash word. They would call themselves some good old American word. But what I wanted to do was describe a structure that I can see taking root. That is what I regard as the enemy of one of the main enemies of democracy, with communism. And describe its structure so we could recognize it. And we have faced it here before. And if you look at Black American intellectuals, Du Bois in Black Reconstruction calls what the form of American racism, he calls it fascism. James Weldon Johnson calls it fascism. It's not unknown among Black Americans to describe what they face as something very similar. And the analogies between the KKK and the Nazi ideology have been well spelled out. You had some differences, like, people didn't rail against large department stores here, but so I think we need a name for this ethno-nationalist, anti-cosmopolitan, patriarchal, macho politics that paints an outgroup as impure and a threat to your women, that raves about mass immigration. Hitler talks about Germany being the laughing stock of the world because of its lax immigration policies, and the Jews were responsible for the lax immigration policies. Here we have the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society archives. So I think you have an exportable ideology that you see in multiple countries, and people forget that Nazis are just the most extreme version. I mean, you had British fascist movements, you had the America First movement.
So talk a little bit about how you think, we have this thing we call American conservatism, right? Or kind of right-wing politics, I don't know, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, right? And then where is the line between, between that and fascism, and how would you tell the story of what happens on the American right over the decades that brings us to Donald Trump?
That's an excellent question, because of course we have 9/11, we have the various things that lead to outgrouping Muslims. We had mass incarceration. We had in the 1990s. But it's not just the conservatives. It's Clinton. We had both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party when crime started dropping. I always ask my students, under what New York mayor did violent crime start violently dropping? And they all say Giuliani, and I say no, Dinkins. It just started dropping in 1991, and the panic about mass incarceration, super predator theory, comes in 1995, and they even say, John DiIulio even says, violent crime has been dropping, but cork the champagne bottles because the super predators are coming.
Right.
So we have this history on both sides of the aisle of vilifying, vilifying Black Americans in particular. We're seeing a return to earlier times where immigrants were also part of that. The 1924 Immigration Act is something that Hitler praises, both in his second book and Mein Kampf. He says, so we have this history. That said, it's the anti-fascism of the conservatives that has always saved us. So, you have mistakes when you face fascist movements. Both the right wing and the left wing can make mistakes. The left wing can aim its ire at the center left, the right wing can say, okay, we'll co-opt their message, and so American fascism is on the extreme of a continuum, of the right wing continuum, like communism is on the extreme of the left wing continuum, but you have these dangerous moments where people are like, let's play with the outgrouping. Maybe that we'll sacrifice our other values, and those are and of course you have the return to the traditional past that overlaps.
You talked about 9/11 a little bit. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the role of Islamophobia in American fascism today, and if there are similarities or differences with the role that anti-Semitism has played in the past, or indeed the role that anti-Semitism is playing today.
Good. So my students have been we've been reading Arendt, part one of Origins of Totalitarianism, and we were discussing this. Of course, there are historical specificities that faced Jews in the 19th century in Western Europe. There's no Rothschild sends his 5 sons to the 5 different capitals to get 5 different citizenships, thereby setting up this model of Jews as this globalist international group that Jews were connected with Bolshevism, with leftism. We don't have Muslims necessarily connected with leftism, but the idea of a 5th column, like what Arendt emphasizes again and again, is the idea that there's the Jews were a 5th column. Their real loyalty was to other Jews. And to me, I see that with Islamophobia today. The idea that Muslims really are something like a 5th column and their loyalty is to elsewhere. If we had a Dreyfus affair, I suspect it would be, it would be hard to see it would be a Jewish military officer. A Dreyfus affair that generated that panic would be, I think, with a Muslim officer. So that's my fear, that the 5th column people, the people who can't, and Europe as well, like the idea that Muslims are a 5th column whose real loyalty is to Islam, that's worrisome to me, because in the past that's associated with a certain kind of treatment.
Right, and in terms of this, what appears to be some kind of resurgence of anti-Semitism as well, do you also see it as connected to this idea still also of Jews as well as Muslims being a kind of a 5th column, not having loyalty, or is there some different, what is the difference between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia today?
Good. So right now what we're seeing is what scholars talk about when they talk about Judeo-Bolshevism. We're seeing leftist Jews getting targeted. So Hitler targeted leftist Jews. They were the idea. I mean, some Orthodox Jews at the time, as Ali Stern has pointed out in Tablet magazine, made the mistake of thinking that he only targeted leftist Jews. No, Hitler thought that, Hitler was an anti-Semite in the most basic sense of targeting Jewish bodies regardless of their practice or belief. And but right now we have. But he certainly, the idea in the protocols, and Hitler's idea was that Jews were behind communism. Jews were, running the institutions of higher learning, the universities. They were turning the universities leftist, the press leftist. And so right now we're seeing an attack on cosmopolitan leftists. We've added to that gender ideology. So Viktor Orban closed Central European University, not just for Marxism, but for gender ideology. And so we see that structure, and it's often left-wing Jews, as it was in the 1930s, German Jews and liberal Jews, what Isaac Deutscher called non-Jewish Jews, who were the target.
Yet there are certain elements of the American Jewish community in particular that would argue that there's a threat of anti-Semitism from the left as well, maybe even as great as anti-Semitism from the right. They would point to Jeremy Corbyn, maybe they'd even point to Ilhan Omar and say, look, she was invoking the idea of Jews as perhaps having some kind of, depending on how you parse her words, maybe she was talking about AIPAC, at least AIPAC, suggesting AIPAC had some kind of dual allegiance. How do you, as someone who would identify yourself as someone on the left, as I would, how do you think through that question?
So I'm a philosopher of language by training, Department of Linguistics, both in linguistics and in philosophy, and writing a book on political rhetoric now. We're hearing a lot of debates about dog whistles happening. We're hearing debates about dog whistles. Was that an anti-Semitic dog whistle? Did they know it was an anti-Semitic dog whistle? Do you have to know that it's a dog whistle in order for, so we're familiar with this with dog whistles about racism, inner city, welfare. Now we're having those debates about anti-Semitism, right? Which is, so cultural, so David Brooks started talking about cultural Marxists. My colleague Samuel Moyne has published in the New York Times, laying out the connection between the expression cultural Marxism and Jews. Like, Jews are, it has anti-Semitic associations. So there's a lot of unknowing stuff happening. David Brooks is not an anti-Semite, but what is he doing using cultural Marxist? So, no Jewish person should use cultural Marxism or Judeo-Bolshevism, for that matter. So Ilhan Omar, said something that could be construed as a dual loyalty comment, and she shouldn't do that because Muslims are being suspected of dual loyalties. So we got to all be together in this, as Heschel would have said. I mean, we all got to be together and recognize we're kind of in similar situations.
Right. And what do you think that would look like exactly? I mean, what would you want the organized American Jewish community to do, particularly on the question of Islamophobia, in this moment?
I think we have to tell our stories, like I try to tell my stories, and talk about, we have to have a conversation with our non-Jewish friends who don't understand the complexity of Jewish life and the complexity, the sense in which we are connected even across strong disagreements. So I think we should, we have to have a debate amongst ourselves, obviously. But to me, my responsibility is to look for those patterns. Also, I'm a philosopher. I'm a philosophy professor. And so my philosophical ethos is to look for patterns, for general patterns, and to describe the truth. And so I'm both as a Jew for my background and because my calling is as a philosopher, I'm drawn to just call it like I see it.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, one of the tragedies is that I think one particular element of the American Jewish community that's particularly well positioned actually to explain why Muslims can be observant Muslims and also be loyal Americans are Orthodox Jews in particular, because I think often Christians don't really understand the idea of having a religious law.
Right.
And so when people talk always in these kind of menacing terms about Sharia, it's always to me that the best positioned people would be to come to say, look, there are religious courts in Brooklyn where people solve real estate disputes. It doesn't mean that they're actually not loyal to the United States. In fact, the Orthodox community says kind of models the way in which actually you can try to abide by a religious law and be fully, participatory in the society. And I think that's a kind of voice that unfortunately isn't heard as much as it might be.
It's very deep. I mean, my only living relatives, my brother and I are the only survivors. I mean, we have half cousins on my father's side, but my mother lost 8 of her great aunts and uncles and all of their children. And my only relatives, my only full cousins, are my 4 ultra-Orthodox Litvak cousins in Lakewood and Midwood. And we have political disagreements. But, I'm the leftist Jewish cousin. And so, yes, I think you're absolutely right. It's also the case that I can attest that my ultra-Orthodox Litvak cousins are extremely patriotic Americans.
Right.
Extremely
right.
patriotic Americans.
Right.
So we need our Orthodox brothers and sisters to play a role in to make these points. Unfortunately, I think it's a voice. They're connecting themselves to a large degree with a fundamentalist community, the evangelical Christian community, which has come a long way since the 1930s when Gerald Smith and other anti-Semitic Protestant preachers were really, so the American Christian community has come very far, but ultimately, we need the Orthodox voice to witness a healthy American, deeply religious life.
Right.
You're absolutely right.
I wanted to ask about a few of the parts of the book that I found really interesting, and the things you connect fascism to. So one of the things that you talk about is the relationship between fascism and gender, and the way fascists talk about threats to women and the role of women, and certainly something that's been just come up in the Trump era in terms of the constant invocation of rape and the association with immigrants of rape, that as Donald Trump did when he announced his presidential campaign. So talk a little about the role gender plays in fascist discourse.
Right. So chapter 8 of my book is called Sexual Anxiety, which is about the outgroup men are always miscegenation threats. That's why your laws ban. The Nazis came here to study our anti-miscegenation laws as the model for the Nuremberg laws, and they were like, one drop, that's crazy. We'll go with 1/8. But so there's this sort of fetishization around protecting our women. And since there's a fetishization around protecting our women, the outgroup men are always rape threats. So this happened with the Rohingya. The Rohingya, in 2012, 3 Rohingya men raped a Ranking woman, and all the Rohingya were constrained in 200 villages.
It's in Myanmar. Right?
What?
It is in Myanmar.
In Myanmar.
Yeah.
So, and they were supposedly rapists. So this is the trope. The Jews were bringing in rapists and were rapists. So gender is key. This is something Hannah Arendt, because she's theorizing about totalitarianism. I hate to criticize Arendt, but it's a somewhat uneven book for that reason. Chapter 1, because the last chapter is she's discussing communism and fascism together, and so she doesn't mention the key role patriarchy plays. In The Authoritarian Personality, Adorno and Elsa Frankel-Brunswick they have the F scale. That book was originally going to be called The Fascist Personality, but he changed it for political reasons, The Authoritarian Personality. But the F scale is supposed to be a measure of fascism. And lots of what it measures is patriarchal sentiment. And Elsa Frankel-Brunswick became a child psychiatrist looking at patriarchal families. Wilhelm Reich, in the first 3 chapters of The Mass Psychology of Fascism, focuses on the patriarchal father. When Kanye West met with Trump in the White House, everyone ignored what he said as foolish. But if you know the history of fascism, what he said was not foolish. He said, my whole life, I grew up without a father. My whole life I didn't have one. And when Mr. Trump ran for office, I thought, I finally have a father. For those of us who are aware of the role of patriarchy and fascism, that's a very deep comment.
So explain it a little more. You're talking about the way in which a fascist leader becomes a kind of a symbol of a kind of father of the nation.
Yeah, as I always say to my 3-year-old, in fascism, there's one big daddy. So it's also the case that in fascism, and Italian fascism and German fascism differ a little here, but in Hitler's speech, I talk about this in the book, Hitler's speech to the industrialists in Düsseldorf in 1933. And he says to them, you organize your companies according to the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle. You have a leader and followers. Similarly, fascism, we have a leader and followers. So you CEOs should be linked with us. Fascism likes the military, it likes the patriarchal family, it likes the private company, because they are not democratic. They're not organized in a flat, equal way. So the patriarchal family is like the the father rules by force, not by moral authority. And so force is the principle of fascist legitimacy.
So does that mean that societies where families are organized in a more patriarchal way are more susceptible to fascist politics?
That was Adorno's theory in The Authoritarian Personality, and that's that's the F scale. So, and that's I laugh when my friend Jonathan Haidt talks about like Marxism in the university and the Frankfurt School, because social psychology, the discipline of which Jonathan Haidt is a member, derives from the Frankfurt School and the F scale and studying authoritarian personalities. All those people are calling like Marxists, and, so yeah.
Another theme of the book is about, or another element of the book is about fascism and economic inequality. And obviously, there's been a lot of debates since Trump's election about how much of this is kind of racial backlash, how much of this is economic despair. And so talk about the role of economic inequality in fascism.
Well, I think what you have is a role of delegitimizing the elites, which both the financial crisis did and the Iraq war here. So when you delegitimize the elites, you face either hope or, last time I was around this area was during Occupy in Union Square. So either hope or you have other ways of questioning of questioning elites. And I think what Trump very skillfully did was exploit, like, I wrote the New York Times, like, one of their first editorials on Trump in October 2015, because I was seeing him as a tremendous threat. The first Republican debate, he was asked, you support Clinton, you've given her money. He said, I've given money to most of the people on this desk here, on this up here, on this Diaz, you know, that's what you do with politicians. So I immediately freaked out and was like, he's gonna, because if you paint the system as corrupt, then you can be as corrupt as you want. If you paint the system as corrupt, then, you know, you're going to be the authentic candidate. And there's social psychology research on this by Elia Zuckerman at MIT called The Authenticity of the Lying Demagogue, where they show people, subjects, a game that's clearly rigged, and they ask them who the most authentic candidate is, and it's the candidate who's explicitly cheating and lying. So if you can convince people the system is rigged. Now, that's not to say that economic inequality is how he won. He was constantly priming race. So my colleague Jennifer Richardson, the great social psychologist, has this experiment where she divides people into 3 groups, white Americans. And the first group, she says, in 2042, the Netherlands will be majority-minority. The next group, she says, in 2042, the United States will be majority senior citizen. And the third group, she says, in 2042, the United States will be majority-minority. And then she asks them a series of political questions. And that third group becomes much more anti-affirmative action, much more anti-immigration, and, curiously, much more for increased defense spending. So Trump was constantly talking about replacement. And you have to realize how dangerous this talk is. I mean, Brenton Tarrant's manifesto in New Zealand was called The Great Replacement. You know, when they say Jews will not replace you, who are the people pushing replacement? Supposed to be. So.
Right. He also constantly talks about immigrants as invaders, which is a language that Trump uses all the time. So if, just thinking about how this story may play forward, if one of the drivers of this fascism is the anxiety that demagogic politicians can create based on the idea that the country's demography is changing, and it is changing, that might suggest a future in which we have ever more politicians who basically play on this threat, and that as the percentage of Muslims, Latinos, African Americans, Asians rises and rises, we have ever more virulent fascism. Is that something you worry about? How do we avoid that future?
Do I worry about that? Usually I'm asked, can you solve this?
Yeah.
Well, we have a flexibility in American life. The Irish Americans, Italian Americans were once not white.
Right.
So, you can see the affirmative action struggle with Asian Americans struggling around. Whiteness has this complexity here. So there's always been these struggles about who is white and who is... That's not new. One of the things we have to see is what we're facing is not new. Like, in liberal democracy, when you make 2 strides forward, you feel like progress is inevitable. But it isn't. America's always been fighting with white nationalism. I mean, white nationalism was our original creed. And that we face white nationalism. I mean, some of the leaders you mentioned, Nixon, he was an anti-Semite. He was to me, what's important is that we Jewish Americans clearly side against white nationalism because, for self-interest and also because of our Jewish values.
Right.
But I think one thing is not to panic. We have Black Americans have been writing about this and theorizing about it and thinking about it for a very long time. And in their work, my work deeply draws on the work of Black American intellectuals, and they've survived. So,
you talk. Another point you make in the book that I found interesting was you talked about this question of corruption, and you talked just now about how Trump painted the American political system as corrupt, which a lot of Americans believed, right? But then the dilemma that many people wonder about is, well, he's so nakedly corrupt, right? Why would people who are disgusted by a corrupt political system then turn to him as someone who kind of flaunts his corruption more than most politicians? How do you explain that?
Well, so that's the Ezra Zuckerman piece in American Journal of Sociology, I believe, February 2018. Well, it's also, you know, it's funny. There's two disciplines I draw on a lot, history and social psychology, and they kind of repeat. Du Bois, in Black Reconstruction, when he's talking about what happened to end Reconstruction, the period right after the Civil War when Black Americans, you know how they're always like, it's the first Black senator from the South since Reconstruction. It was the time when 4 million black vote people had the vote in the South, and then it ended. So that was a time of hope that ended. And why did it end? Du Bois says, they said that the black-run cities and towns and the black majority legislators were corrupt. That's how they ended Reconstruction, with the charge of corruption. They said, what do they mean by corruption? They meant that 4 million black Americans could finally vote. And if you look at what happens now, I've written about Flint, Michigan, and the Emergency Manager Act in Michigan. Think of what they did. They took over Flint, Michigan with an emergency manager, replaced the mayor and the city council because of financial incompetence and corruption. And they poisoned the place. You know, so you know, we have to be careful about representing, you know, minority groups as corrupt, because, you know, this history of targeting women, you know, women running for office as corrupt, because how could they have otherwise gotten there? So, right.
You also talk about the fascist antipathy towards labor unions, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about that and the role that labor unions could play in fighting against fascism.
So that was something that in my research I was really surprised about. So there's sort of my work differs from like the Madeleine Albright and the Timothy Snyder kind of work, in that I'm saying, hold steady, this is our history. You know, this is not radically new. So,
labor unions.
Oh, labor unions. Yeah. So, if you look at the history of labor unions here, you have the right-to-work laws, for instance. I talk about in my book about Vincent Muse, one of the originators of the right-to-work laws, was talking about the Jewish-run labor unions. So that's a common theme. You don't have communism having such a big effect in the United States. You had in like 1919 and the teens and the 20s, but you know, Bolshevism, the tactic of fascism is always to raise panic about Bolsheviks, about communists. And so, as Goebbels said, the middle class won't run into our arms unless they're convinced that the Bolsheviks are around the corner. Labor unions typically represent, were painted as communists. And as far as the solution, I was very surprised to find in both Du Bois's Black Reconstruction and Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism the thought that labor unions are the way out. Du Bois says that the northern industrialists caved to the southern segregationists when they saw the labor union movement as unifying poor blacks and poor whites. That's the aim of the labor union, to create cross-class boundaries. And Arendt, too, says labor unions create identity along class lines and material lines. And that is a danger to what she calls the mob, that orients itself along racial, ethnic, national lines. So this idea that Jews are behind labor unions, you know, to make everyone communist and, you know, to push racial equality and miscegenation, that is there in Europe, it's there in the United States. And so, you know, when you dissolve labor unions, you create isolated individuals who are not working together to combat things. And so then they need an identity, and the identity that will be given to them more often than not will be whiteness.
Right. No, I think that you know, the Democratic Party's struggles with the white working class are not connected enough in popular discussion to the decline of labor unions.
Well, the white working class is a vexed expression. if you read Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, he has a chapter, A Poor White, and he's always talking about that category of people, poor whites.
Right.
So we have to remember the concept white working class has a long history and a vexed history.
Right.
Like there's a black working class.
Right.
They were hit the hardest by the Great Recession,
Right.
and they didn't start backing, anti-democratic,
Right, absolutely. But when you had the United Auto Workers, for instance, taking white people to the March on Washington, they were
Right.
able to tell those white people basically a story about their economic struggles, which didn't end with racism. It ended with some kind of class.
And that's why Martin Luther King died in a labor strike.
Right.
So this history of labor unions, the weak labor unions, what I've learned from my research are labor unions are a central weapon in democracy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we know why they're a central weapon in democracy, and that's not to say that they aren't deeply flawed and they can't be corrupt, but public goods, the idea that, we need some mechanism to protect ourselves from capitalist degradation, neoliberal deprivation, and those are public goods, parks, a basic minimum wage. The weekend, I like the weekend. It's disappearing. My students are like, we won't know the weekend.
I think we have questions from the audience. So whenever you want, I'm happy to see what you guys have to say. But while we're waiting for that, let me just ask one or two more questions. One of the things that Steve Bannon is famously interested in is somehow getting all of these hyper-nationalists around the world together into some kind of international...
Fascist International, 1928 to 1935.
Right. It always seemed to me that, by its nature, that would be a hard group to get together, right? Since basically they're all extremely hostile and distrustful to people of nations other than their own, right? But what do you see as the historical analog to that? And do you think that that's actually... this actually could emerge as a kind of a global fascist movement?
Ethno-nationalism. We see ethno-nationalist movements. Netanyahu is linked with, Orban and the Law and Justice Party and Modi. They're linked because they're all like, you can be that, and the evangelical, if America's Christian, then Israel can be Jewish, and India can be Hindu, and so Russia can be Eastern Orthodox. And our role, this is why I see my German Jewish heritage is so central. My family was German and Jewish. My grandmother, Michael Curtis, the director of Casablanca, was going to do a movie about my grandmother, and she refused to do it because it made Germans look bad. Now, I'm American. I'm American, and I'm a liberal, and I'm a Jew. And, my role as a German Jew is to say that's possible.
Right. There's one line I remember in the New Zealand Killer's manifesto. He has one line about Jews, and he says something along the lines of, "I like Jews as long as they stay in their country." Right.
Exactly.
So it's this kind of idea that everything is fine as long as you don't go and basically create miscegenation and pollute other people's places.
People say, "Oh, it's great. Everyone should have self-determination." But what does that mean in countries that are already diverse? What does it mean, self-determination, in a country where you already have Jews and Muslims and not just Christians and Hindus and atheists? That you're calling for ethnic cleansing. So it sounds great, people's self-determination. I should also add, I'm not really sure what it is for a people to self-determine. I know what it is for an individual to self-determine. But that's the worry. It sounds great. Why can't everyone live in their own country and self-determine? But that would require a massive something happening to me as a diasporic Jew in the United States. And my parents both came in boats past the Staten Island, past the Statue of Liberty to New York Harbor. That's my legacy, and I'm not, that means standing up for America as a multi-religious, multi-ethnic democracy.
Right. Great. So let's see what we have here from all of you. Do you see any hope of Trump's seemingly loyal base recognizing that he does not represent their interests? So how? Or does he represent their interests?
So I don't think history. I mean, have people read Ari Hochschild's *Strangers in Their Own Land*? It's a terrific book about Louisiana, and it is 5 years of reporting on people acting against their own material self-interest, and they do it. My friend Jonathan Metzl has this brilliant book called *Dying of Whiteness*, where he talks about how Tennessee and Kansas are destroying their school systems, their healthcare systems, all because and it's killing the white population, all because they don't want the undeserved to get the goods. So, I think Jonathan Metzl's work shows in very strong ways that people will act against their own self-interest. Victor Klemperer, chapter 18 of Language of the Third Reich is, I still believe in him, as I believe in him. And it's all about how people, not to make any analogies between Trump, I do not want to make an analogy between Trump and Hitler. Hitler is kind of unique in his anti-Semitism, in his murderous anti-Semitism. But Trump wants that kind of wants a kind of following that you get, and Klemperer's point is they still believed in Hitler all the way to the end, and he was much worse, obviously, than what we're seeing.
So to play out one of the questions asked about socialism, and so at the same time that we've had a reviving discussion about fascism in the United States, it's also a revived conversation about socialism, of course, Trump says this is bringing America to making America like Venezuela, and so you talked about the fascism as the antithesis of democracy. Talk about socialism and its relationship to democracy.
So first of all, it is the classic fascist tactic. It certainly was what Mussolini and Hitler did: raise panic about leftists and paint the center-left party as communists. So that was like the standard trick. William Sheridan Allen's book on Thalberg, a town that went from majority Social Democrat to Nazi in 5 years, he explains that process as in two ways. First, the Nazis successfully painting the Social Democrats as communists, and then the left, the far left, painting the Social Democrats as like fascists. So socialism, I think that socialism plays this rhetorical role that you see with Trump's rhetoric. The enemy's bringing us socialism, the socialists are dominating the universities. I think that the thing called socialism today is something that, is connected with basically the New Deal, with basic things, structures of common goods that other Western democracies have. And I'd like people to recognize that democracy involves public goods, things that there's no such thing as a democratic culture without Central Park. Central Park is democracy. Democracy is about equality. And so you have to have a basis for equality. And we're using socialism too much as a name for, democracy.
Right. So one thing that just to follow up on the socialism, but one thing that one tends to hear on the political right today, and including in respectable conservative circles a lot, and I ask you this as someone who lives in the university, is that there are fascist or at least authoritarian or highly illiberal currents that have emerged on the left in university climates. I think Bret Stephens, the New York Times columnist, just a couple days ago said that the firing of Ian Baruma, for instance, at New York Review of Books was an act of fascism. Left fascism. So as someone who lives at the university, is there any truth to that? Do you worry about the way in which leftist movements for, that are fighting historical injustice in the United States can be prone to some of these tendencies?
There's a panic against the universities right now, and it goes to our donors, and the donors are pressing huge pressure on the university to not be, quote-unquote, ideological. Which means, in practice, that the economics departments get more hires. As I said to some of my university administrators the other day, so we wouldn't hire Hannah Arendt because, she's not an economist. Like, economics is not ideological. So who do you think has more power at Yale University, the economics department or the African American Studies department? I mean, give me a, it's so our donor base are, I do see a problem in the university. The problem is corporatism. People care too much about their reputation. The university has to be a critical place. It has to be a place where free speech rights are defended. It has to be, and there's a corporate fear in the university. But the university is the place. Of course, the university is being attacked for free speech because the university is a place where speech is freest. I think you saw Trump's free speech initiative. They're going to police. They're going to make sure speech isn't policed by policing free speech, policing speech. So they're going to police speech in the academy. And I've long been writing about this topic, that free speech is being, as a leftist at Yale, one of the few leftists at Yale, it's a place where there's a lot of people support Clinton, but I wouldn't really call. I mean, we had like 89% of our faculty donated to Clinton, but I wouldn't call Clinton some kind of wild-eyed Marxist. Try being a Sanders supporter at Yale University. That's no easy, or Harvard. That's not easy. And there's so much donor pressure to hammer back against, during the 2015-2016 Yale student movement, whatever errors of judgment were made, my students came to me and said, nobody's seen a black philosopher on a philosophy syllabus, and this is the United States, and they wanted people not to be able to graduate Yale University without understanding why Black Lives Matter happened. So that was their goal, and they might have made mistakes, and I certainly think they did, and I'm against no platforming and things like that, but America needs to talk about white nationalism.
So there are a number of questions which kind of ask in various ways what the lessons of history and your analysis of fascism can teach the Democrats in their effort to beat Donald Trump in 2020.
Well, I should say I'm actually not so involved in, I like describing things. I don't like saying what we ought to do because I feel like I lose a bit of my objectivity if I do that. I like to look at templates I think that's where I'm most useful. I'm highly critical of. I mean, Joe Biden wrote the 1994 crime bill. Kamala Harris was put people in prison for truancy. The Democrats, we are a white nationalist country. I mean, we have been. We fight that. We fight that. We have this legacy. The Democrats can be tempted by it just as the Republicans are tempted by it. We are reminded again by the explicit politics that we have to face this legacy and will again.
So we also have a number of questions, maybe not surprisingly, but about the question of Israel. One of the questions actually asks about this ad, I don't know if you saw it, where Israel's Justice Minister, Ayelet Shaked, actually, this kind of weird ad where she seems to be kind of smelling this perfume called fascism, and it seems she seems to be quite enjoying it, seems to be. So what do you make of that? To what degree are we seeing the same trends that you're concerned about in the United States and in Europe and South Asia in Israel, and how should one respond to this, and what is the relationship between that and Zionism?
Well, one of the things that is interesting about us as a community is we have a greater understanding of fascism and a greater understanding of anti-Semitic tropes than non-Jews. So Israel, of course, they have a very sophisticated understanding. So The Intercept has a great piece on how Steve Bannon made Breitbart a pro-Israel site for anti-Semitic white nationalists. And he shows some propaganda by right-wing Israeli parties that targets left-wing Jews and shows them as sort of like a fifth column in Israel. So you have a sophisticated understanding of things among my understanding of the propaganda situation in Israel. And I look at many countries, propaganda situations in those countries. In Israel, you have a sophisticated understanding that what fascism is, I suspect. And so people, just as they flirt with, like, you know, you can flirt with anti-Semitic, you know, targeting Judeo-Bolshevism there. There are right-wing parties. The far right is dominating Israel. The far right is dominating the United States. The far right is dominating a lot of countries, and the far right is the far right. So
there's another question which has to do with the Catholic Church, and I wanted to just broaden a little bit in terms of what role you see as what is the relationship between Christianity in the United States and fascism is. Christianity as a bulwark for fascism and white supremacy, and also potentially Christianity as an instrument against it.
So historically, it's been both, of course. So as Sam Moyne has argued, we owe the concept of human rights to the Christian faith. And I'm a Western philosopher. You know, whenever I've talked to my cousins, they kind of suspect I'm some kind of Talmud scholar of Christianity. But that's not entirely incorrect for Western philosophy. So, you know, Aquinas and Augustine, I cannot be anti the Christian faith, whatever that would mean, because my discipline is based in those thinkers. On the other hand, there is, you know, liberalism, Jews, you know, religious toleration from Spinoza onwards. Jews have been associated with the drive for liberalism, and liberalism means that, you know, faith communities and political communities must be separate. And I see a movement in the far right here and the far right in Israel to blur that, to associate citizenship with a faith community, you know, and of course, what happens is in those moments, like Jerry Falwell Jr. is falling, you know, then sort of, you know, says, okay, we'll flirt with white nationalism if that, and you get, of course, you know, as Baldwin says in Negroes are anti-Semitic because they're anti-white, he talks about black anti-Semitism, and he says black anti-Semitism is horrific because it is the worst. Slavery and anti-Semitism are the two worst sins of the cross.
There's a question here about the relation between democracy and fascism, and I wanted to ask you, you talk about fascism as the enemy of democracy, I think, rather than fascism as the enemy of liberalism. And I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about the relationship there. Some, you know, Fried Zakaria famously talked about illiberal democracy, right? The idea that you could actually have free elections, the majority could have its will expressed, but actually that could be brutally authoritarian because it could have lack of any respect for minority rights. And so talk about the relationship between democracy and liberalism and fascism.
Right, absolutely. So democracy, so in my work, when I talk about democracy, I'm basically talking about liberal democracy. Democracy can be understood as a voting system, majority rules, a set of institutions like parliament, free press, universities, public goods, or a culture. And when you understand democracy as a culture, then it's liberalism. The culture of democracy, even dating back to Plato's 8th book, when Plato describes a democratic city. And he says the democratic city is one where liberty and equality reign supreme. Because he's talking about democracy as a culture. Democracy respects freedom. And freedom will, as Plato says, will lead to equality, because you've got to give everyone freedom. So when you think of democracy as a culture, which is what we political philosophers think of it as, not as a voting system, because obviously, you know, the fascists were voted in because there wasn't a democratic culture. So a democratic culture, for me, is liberal. And you can have illiberal democracy where you just have a majority vote, and an illiberal culture, a fascist culture.
The last question I want to ask is about, as a professor, a teacher, about education. So what do you think, what do you think is the best way that you can use the educational system to try to prepare people to fight against fascism? And what do you see as perhaps some of the failings in the American education system in not helping people do that?
So I like, you know, I was raised to think I always had to go back to Germany, so I did. I went to my 11th grade in Germany as an exchange student, went to a year in college in Tübingen there. So I know a lot about the way Germans have faced their past. And to me also it was very important time because people talk about microaggressions. I was in Germany in the 80s. There were still 70-year-old Nazis walking around. They were like the grandparents of my friends. And I was microaggressed all the time. Like my friends would say, oh, you know, say some innocent comments about you know, what their grandparents are doing. And I would flip out. There was something difficult about being in the country. And then that enabled me to understand a little bit about what it must be like to be black in America. And I had to leave Germany every once in a while because it got so stressful. And black Americans don't leave to go to like Holland or London. So education here we have to confront our past. We just absolutely have to confront our past. We absolutely have to confront the great things about our past. And the great things about our past, to me, is we fought the fascists. We've been fighting our legacy of white nationalism our entire existence. To me, that's where my American pride lies. Frederick Douglass's 1852 speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," where he says, "Liberty? You have me coming here to talk about liberty? Are you kidding?" You know, but we have liberty here. We have those, and those values are things that we can push on. And so our education system absolutely has to face up to the reality of the past. Germany is the most solid liberal democracy for a reason. And they're not perfect, and they're constantly complaining. Like when I was there in the 1980s, there was the Historikerstreit, where Ernst Nolte and others were saying, it's time to stop apologizing. And that was well before Stolpersteiner. That was well before Peter Eisenman's monument in Berlin. And they were already saying they should stop apologizing. We're always going to get pressure to say you should stop apologizing for slavery. You should stop apologizing for red zoning. You should stop apologizing for indigenous genocide. But no, that's the truth is what will set us free. And the role of the university is to tell the truth and not some glorified version that makes us and others look good.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you, all of you.